A malfunctioning Mars in your consciousness will exhibit the traits of Mars in Cancer, where Mars is debilitated. So Cancer is the zodiac sign or the energetic environment where the Mars agenda within us, it's the least compatible in that sign. But this doesn't mean that if you have Mars in Cancer, that your Mars is automatically malfunctioning. Although there's a much stronger tendency towards it, especially in the first 30 to 40 years in your life. So your Mars can be in any zodiac sign, but when it's malfunctioning, it's going to be taking on some characteristics of Mars in Cancer, and it's also going to take on other characteristics, which I'm going to talk about. So Mars does poorly in Cancer because Cancer is a movable water sign, which are the two symbols that show us it's the sign of our shifting and changing emotional world. So Mars in our consciousness is the planet of sharp logic. And actually Mars rules over swords and knives, the sharp blades. So a malfunctioning Mars is someone who allows their emotional side to cloud or distract them from thinking logically in a problem-solving situation, like having your sword be dulled, or better yet, the sword being rusted over from water and becoming brittle and not being able to use the sharpness of your logic. It gets worn away, and emotions can cause that confusion between having a really objective frame of mind in a Mars situation, which is a problem-solving situation. But Mars has an emotion attached to it, and Mars's emotions are anger and frustration. And so anger and frustration, the logic of those, then the usefulness of anger and frustration are to motivate you to change something or to get over something. The frustration is meant to push you and make you feel the determination to get out of this whatever situation that's causing you to be frustrated. So an unhealthy Mars won't actually make the effort and use the willpower to change whatever it is that's causing the person to feel frustrated, and they can wallow in that frustration and they'll just steep themselves in that anger instead of using Mars well in order to strategize yourself out of that situation very logically. So these people with a malfunctioning Mars, they're not creating an intelligent, logical, and efficient plan of action to get themselves out of that frustrated mode, or their plan is unintelligent and not working, and so they're just creating this cycle of frustration. So that's how a malfunctioning Mars is not finding a way out of that anger-inducing situation. So I worked in restaurants for a couple periods of my life when I was in high school, and then for a time when I was in New York. And if you work in restaurants, you'll learn that the chefs in restaurants, they have this reputation of being explosive and very highly charged individuals, and a lot of them can have anger issues. So actually one of the careers of Mars, if Mars is a career planet in your chart, it can make a person become a chef, because chefs are constantly working with knives, and Mars rules fire. It's a fire planet, and chefs are always cooking. They're always using fire. So on a deeper level, the aspect of a knife, the knife is a symbol of cutting out unnecessary details or to separate certain details into parts that are easier to control and manipulate, like cutting up ingredients. Well, restaurants are very highly intense places, and during the rush period of time, if it's a poorly run restaurant, it feels like you're running from emergency situation to emergency situation, and you're constantly solving problems. But a malfunctioning Mars in our consciousness, in the specific role of a chef, they allow these tense situations to overwhelm them, and they have these explosions of anger, and they get extremely frustrated. And that's why chefs have that reputation for being angry, because they're already a very Mars person. Their career, their work in the world is heavily influenced by Mars. But since restaurants are so intense, that Mars emotion can really boil over. And when Mars is malfunctioning, they have those anger issues. But I've worked with other chefs that are not like that. They're not explosive and angry. They have very functional and highly developed Mars. And they can be very cool under pressure, very logical, and be able to get through intense situations without the frustration boiling over. And so we're going to discuss more how to have this healthy Mars in our consciousness in the next video. So really the most obvious quality of a weak and malfunctioning Mars is someone who finds themselves always surrounded by conflicts. Either they're instigating fights with other people, or they can't get themselves out of dramatic situations, and it just becomes this unhealthy cycle where they're always in this kind of fear response, or they have this stress and this cortisol because they don't know how to get themselves out of the conflict. And as I say, life is conflict. We're always having to solve problems in life. But a weak Mars individual is not able to really intelligently strategize themselves out of the conflict, and their life just feels like this endless string of tense events, and they never seem to let up. And they're just surrounded by drama. Either other people are bringing drama to them, they're bringing drama to others, but they're always in this kind of very tense frame of mind because of the conflicts. So what these people need to work on is their abilities for using effective strategy, conflict resolution, and to help them to avoid unnecessary problems and avoid fights, and to train themselves on how to really avoid those situations when their Mars will get triggered. So some people with an unhealthy Mars, they'll go out and they'll be looking for fights. And when you take that on the macro level, you have what are the warmongers in political situations. And so what's the craziest part about warmongers in our current modern military society is that these people who are instigating wars and instigating fights with other countries, these aren't the actual people who are doing the fighting. They want other people to go fight for them. So in the past, the generals and the commanders, the ones who are the military planners, the ones who are ruling over the war, they were a part of the conflicts themselves. Usually they're right on the battlefield. Look at Napoleon. They said having Napoleon on the battlefield was like having 40,000 men. And so in the past, they had these people that would either plan a war or defend their country through the war. They were really right there in the battle with the troops. And so those generals who had to be on the battlefield, they knew how costly war was, physically, morally, and financially, etc. And it's why Sun Tzu in The Art of War says, to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. Or if you can win without ever having to actually fight, that's the height of military ability. So the ethos of wars today seems to be the opposite of that, in that the longer the war is, the more drawn out the fighting is, the better it is. Because those people aren't actually doing any of the fighting. They're just sitting in their penthouses or in their big mansions, reaping the financial benefits, and they're often just on entirely different continents. They're nowhere near the battle. So you'll see people with a weak Mars in their consciousness, they're either not able to strategize themselves out of the problem, or they're the kind of people that are surrounding themselves in problems and conflicts that they're not equipped to resolve themselves, and instead they'll be instigating fights with other people, and they want other people to join in their fights or their cause, even if that cause is not beneficial to the people that they're trying to include. So these weak Mars individuals, they don't feel they have this inner strength to resolve the problem, so they want to bring other people to solve it for them. They feel more powerful, and they feel like their willpower is exerting itself healthily when they get other people, or they even trick other people, manipulate other people to fight for them. But really what they have is a weak Mars, or a weak ability to solve conflicts in their own life. So we talked about how Mars is this impulse within us to respond to emergencies, which is fast-paced problem solving, and also about how the slow-paced problem solving of implementing a strategy. Well, a trait of Mars in Cancer is to lose that willpower to affect change on your environment, which is the trait of being excessively passive and not asserting what you desire. So a weak and unhealthy Mars in your consciousness is someone who is a pushover and receptive when it's proper to be forthright and assertive about what it is that you want. So when you're not using the Mars quality of defending yourself or defending what you want or what you desire to happen, it's a malfunctioning Mars. You're too passive and not being upfront about what it is that you want to see, or being upfront about your opinion and your ideas about how you want your life to to be working, and especially in a conflict situation, not standing up and really saying your 2 cents about something, not defending what it is your concepts are about the situation. So when a person is a pushover, or when they have this weak Mars, when they're not expressing their desire, it's not that the desire disappears. The desires, they build up over time, and if they're not being expressed properly, one day the person will just blow up like a volcano. And these people will often seem like a really nice guy or gal and on the surface, and they go along and things are happening, but underneath they're really fuming. And this is the age-old sign of a malfunctioning Mars, the inability to assert yourself and assert what it is that you want to see happen. So desires, frustrations, and anger are all meant to be channeled productively and not simply swept under the rug to be dealt with later. So an unhealthy Mars is in this habit of doing just that, to think that a problem will be solved if you just avoid it or you just forget about it for a little while. And that can be a trait of Mars in Cancer, that passivity. But unhealthy Mars in general, what they'll do is that they'll just try to keep avoiding confronting the problem directly and then unleashing that anger at really poor times, or eventually that anger gets unleashed in the person. And oftentimes, with Mars and Cancer specifically, that anger gets unleashed on feminine figures in the person's life. So whatever sign that Mars is in your chart, it's going to use that sign's attributes as a weapon to solve conflicts and solve problems, because that's what Mars is doing. And so the tendency with Mars in Cancer, or a weak Mars in general, is to use emotions as a weapon. And so there are so many different paths that using emotions as a weapon can go down. But the general traits are gaslighting people, being emotionally manipulative, and also being insincere about your opinions and your desires and what you actually want to see happen, and all of those kinds of cunning traits. And then there is, of course, the raw emotional outrage and emotional expression that gets used as a weapon in order for the person to get what they want. So those people, when their Mars is malfunctioning, that's what they do. When they want to solve a problem, they'll become emotional and use their emotions to get what they want. And those people are very exhausting to be around because they're not expressing their desire in a straightforward, logical, and effective and efficient way and right to the point. And that's how a healthy Mars will express itself, just being direct about what it is that you want. So on the other side of this spectrum of being passive to the point of erupting in emotional outbursts, there's this other unhealthy Mars trait, which is unrequited passion and this unquenchable thirst and desire for things. And this is really the excessive use of willpower. So on the surface, these people seem to have a very strong Mars. So they always are able, or they're able to really assert themselves to get what they want, what they're passionate about getting. And they'll try to conquer situations in order to quench their thirst for something. And so these people, that's a Mars that's really strong. But a strong Mars can also be very unhealthy because you can take that thirst, that passion for something to extreme excesses, and their willpower is getting used in completely materialistic ways. So it's not using the willpower to get rid of passions and for emotional growth and to conquer fears within oneself, or to use the will in order to create character growth. Their will is extremely extroverted all the time and very materialistic. So the best example of a person I like to give about this is Aleister Crowley, and he has an exalted Mars in his chart. So Crowley is most famous for his philosophy of do as thou wilt, and he created an entire belief system of unrestrained will and rising to power or gaining power through the use of the will. And this is an extremely Mars, it's like a pure Mars philosophy. So one of his manifestos, it's called Liber Oz, Liber Oz. And in it he says, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Thou hast no right but to do thy will. Do that, and no other shall say nay. And later on he says, man has the right to kill those who would thwart these rights. The slaves shall serve. So Crowley supporters will say that, oh, he actually didn't mean what you think he meant when he says, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. And he didn't actually mean it when he said you have the right to kill those who thwart your right to express your will unrestrained. And these supporters will say that you have to take his other writings into context to understand his deeper, brilliant meaning. And you have to, read between various lines. And those lines, you can't just take it for what it says right on the surface, which I think all of that is bullshit personally. So I think that Crowley's philosophy is for people who have a weak and insecure Mars in their consciousness. And they get attracted to it because they don't have a healthy willpower in expressing themselves, or they're not using their willpower for internal character growth. And what they want is a philosophical justification that tells them it's okay to do whatever you want. And what other people want or other people desire, that doesn't need to be taken into consideration. So people who follow Crowley or are really attracted to this philosophy, they want this philosophical excuse for unrestrained use of willpower and for throwing discipline out the window, essentially. They don't want to think about using the won't power of Mars, the discipline of Mars. So what Crowley's philosophy of do as thou wilt and a toxic and unhealthy Mars in general, what it leads to is hedonism. So Crowley famously died a desperate and lonely heroin addict, and that was after living a life of him, you couldn't even say he's satisfied, but he wanted to satisfy, or he wanted to pursue every desire and passion that he had to the absolute limit. Anything that he could conjure up, he wanted to use his will to acquire that. And all of this really plays into a very crucial characteristic of Mars, which is what we talked about in the first video, the won't power, which is the flip side of the coin of the willpower. So it's Mars's ability within us to be disciplined and to not use our will at certain points in time for any kind of reason we can think of. So malfunctioning Mars, these people will allow themselves to become slaves to their passions and desires. And Crowley is really the poster boy of this negative Mars trajectory of the excessive use of the will. And remember, he has an exalted Mars in his chart, but through his life, it turned into an extremely toxic and malfunctioning Mars. He took Mars to a whole different level of excess. So what we talked about in the previous video is that the Mars force in us is creating these concepts and ideas and opinions about what we ought to do or ought not to do. And so when our ideas, they're not meshing with other people, or they're way too individualized, other people can't connect with what your ideas are about how things should be done. What happens is that you are not able to work as a teammate with other people. You're a poor associate. You can't harmonize your ideas with other people, and you end up really secluding yourself because there's no kind of workable pattern about how to live life, and you just think that no matter what you believe and think, no matter what your opinion is, it's correct. So this is a very toxic Mars, this is a very malfunctioning Mars, when you're not able to link up your concepts with other people in a productive way. You feel like all of your opinions are making you feel more and more isolated. And even it can be people that are in your daily life, you're feeling isolated in your own life. You're not really able to solve any kind of conflicts and differences of opinions in a healthy manner. So it's about building those character qualities that other people can look at your way of living life and the ideal way of going about life, what you should and shouldn't do, and creating good character qualities and good deeds and actions that show that you're really about what you say you're about, what your opinion expresses. But the opposite of that, the malfunctioning Mars, essentially these people are hypocrites. Their character does not match up with anything about their ideas and concepts. And their actions, what they do, it has no merit or value to it, to anyone other than themselves. So like what I was saying, these people, they They are so into their own ideas that they can't be applied to other people's lives in any other way, shape, or form. They can't link up with other people, so they become isolated. And at worst, they become hypocrites, and they aren't even living out their life that they proclaim to say this is the best way to live. So just a last couple points to end on. We talked about how Mars is this instinctual response to things, the fight, flight, or freeze. So a poorly operating Mars in your consciousness will be the person who flees or freezes in tense and emergency situations when it's proper to stand and fight or to stand and defend. So part of Mars's job is to keep us alive in the most immediate sense. And so a person with a weak Mars lacks this primal ability to get themselves out of a dangerous situation. Sometimes it's necessary to flee, like fleeing a building that's on fire. But the weak Mars will freeze. They'll not have a way of getting themselves out of the situation, and they're getting overcome by fear, kind of like sleep paralysis. When people have that strong, when they're in their bed and they're consciously awake, and they feel a fear presence, and oftentimes they'll feel an entity is around them, but they can't move. They're paralyzed in fear. And that is a weak Mars instinct, and that is a weak Mars operating because it's not able to think quickly on its feet and to get itself out of that situation as quickly as possible. So the last point is that, so a Mars in Cancer, a trait of Mars in Cancer, will have this I don't care ethic to them, this kind of mentality, because they can't muster up the physical and mental strength to use their willpower in order to fight for something that they actually care about. And again, it's that passiveness and that complacency that what can cause when we combine it with the emergency situations, it causes physical injury because of those intense situations, and it causes, a threat to their survival immediately and physically. And it can be rooted in this kind of complacency towards life. And they can even be very fatalistic, that no matter that their will really doesn't matter, that things are just going to happen to them as they're going to happen to them, that they have no kind of, their will isn't as powerful. Their will is more powerful than they realize. And they don't think that they're very powerful people. So a malfunctioning Mars, it doesn't put enough value in that ability to make changes, active changes in your life. And in order to get yourself out of a difficult situation or put yourself back on the right trajectory to get you moving towards something that you're passionate about achieving, or something that your vision, that achieving your vision and getting to somewhere in life that you have to work towards getting to. So that strong sense of effort is missing in these people with a weak Mars.